Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Coordinated Assistance to the States webinar, Reducing the Use of Isolation in Youth Facilities, the Use of Alternative Behavior Management Tools. My name is Ned Loughran. I'm the Executive Director of the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, better known as CJCA. I'm here with Brendan Donahue, Technology Manager for the Performance-Based Standards Learning Institute, who is producing this webinar. And joining us remotely is Sharon Pett, who is the Reducing Isolation Project Manager. The Center for Coordinated Assistance to States was developed in 2014 with a grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, OJJDP. The purpose of the center is to assess the need for and coordinate the delivery of training and technical assistance designed to build capacity within states, territories, and tribal units and communities to maximize the effectiveness of juvenile justice systems to the benefit of the youth they serve. The focus of the center is on providing ongoing coaching to achieve individual or behavioral changes that positively impact the justice system. Joining OJJDP, our partners in this initiative are the American Institutes for Research in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University. Just a few guidelines and housekeeping for today's webinar. Please get your audio through the phone, not through your computer, and be sure and use your PIN number so you can sign on appropriately. Everyone is muted throughout the webinar except for the presenters, obviously. And if you do have a question, and the earlier you ask the question, the sooner we'll be able to answer it at the end of the webinar. So raise your hand in the right-hand column of the right-hand box with a question, or type in the box on the right hand of your screen. We will have questions following all three presentations today. So I'd like to begin by introducing the rest of the consultation team and today's presenters. We have Christine Blessinger, who is the Director of the Indiana Division of Youth Services, Nick Sotelo, who is Youth Development Coordinator of Facility Services for the Oregon Youth Authority, and Peter Forbes, Commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Youth Services. Just by way of introduction, research shows that placing a youth in isolation has negative public safety consequences. It doesn't reduce violence within facilities, and it can really harm the youth psychologically, physically, and developmentally. CJCA's position on isolation is clear. CJCA believes that isolating or confining a youth in his/her room should be used only to protect the youth from harming him or herself or others, and if used, should be for a short period and supervised. This is also the definition for the Performance-Based Standards Initiative for those who are participating in that project. In March 2015, CJCA published a toolkit, Reducing the Isolation, which is available on the CJCA website under Publications. So what we're going to work with today is one of the 5 steps in that toolkit to reduce the use of isolation. Just to refresh your memory for those who have participated before, or to tell those who have not, we begin with the statement of the rehabilitative mission statement and philosophy of the agency. We employ restrictive isolation policies and procedures. We use data to drive practices and measure how we're doing in the use of isolation. And today's theme is developing alternative behavior management tools. And then the 5th one is staff training and support to be able to introduce those behavior management tools. So with that, we welcome all of you to today's webinar, but I want to give a shout out to teams from 6 youth correction jurisdictions that applied and are receiving training from CCAS and technical assistance to reduce isolation. They are the Alaska Division of Juvenile Justice, the Mississippi Division of Youth Services, the Montana Department of Corrections Youth Services Division, the Los Angeles County Probation Department, the Maricopa County Juvenile Probation Department, and Siskiyou County Probation Department in California, the Charlie Bird Youth Corrections Center. And so the question for today is responding to youth behavior. When Bob Listenby, the administrator of the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, met with CJCA administrators soon after he took office, we were discussing the whole issue of isolation with him, and he threw a mandate out to us that we have tried to follow ever since. If not isolation, then what? And so beginning to show you the what, if not isolation, I'd like to again introduce Christine Blessinger, the Director of the Indiana Division for Youth Services. Christine, it's all yours.
Okay. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Before we more closely examine the specific tools that can help reduce the use of isolation, it's important to highlight probably the biggest and the most impactful tools that exist as it relates to reducing the use of isolation. These include positive relationships between youth and staff, skill building, family engagement, and having a strength-based incentive system. So if you think of a garden and the dominant seeds, that if you have that fertile soil, and that would be the mindset of staff and a culture that supports the minimal use of isolation, then these are the seeds that will allow you to have a nice and healthy garden. Positive youth and staff relationships, a strength-based incentive system, and the others listed are going to be the critical pieces to ensuring success. There's that saying that says the easiest way to solve a problem is not to have a problem in the first place. So by having these four pieces embedded in your overall strategy to reduce isolation, you will be more successful in preventing the number of incidents that lead to isolation. So now I'm going to specifically talk to you about what Indiana did. First, we had to redefine isolation. The purpose of isolation is to allow youth time to cool off and stabilize with the goal of returning them to programming as soon as they are de-escalated, instead of thinking of isolation as a consequence or a punishment. You are basically identifying that issue with the youth. What is the problem? Why do you need isolation? Who is reviewing it, and how frequently you are reviewing it? And you're going to look at data regarding the use of isolation in your facilities. In Indiana, we use PBS. Actually, showing data to staff will impact them and how they feel about isolation, and that's what we found. Seeing potentially, how much isolation you're using, looking at how long the youth are in isolation, those are always good topics of discussion to get buy-in from the staff. Also, another thing that we did was let them know about, talk to them about the harmful effects of isolation, the risks of suicide, tell them stories of the, negative effects that isolation can have on youth or specific youth. Keep in mind that data is a consistent improvement. So when you train staff, you have to discuss how you can raise the bar to always continuously improve. Okay, so staff in the area utilize verbal escalation and conflict resolution. For example, so if two youth get into a fight, we would sit those two youth down, talk with them about the reasons for the fight, understanding the conflict, talk to them about their emotions, is the situation done, is it squashed, and discuss with them better ways to resolve conflicts. A lot of times, the youth will just calm down and can go right back to normal activities, and then the treatment team, that works with the kid might discuss any necessary sanctions. But we do everything that we can to keep the youth out of isolation. If we need to, we'll even reclassify the youth to a different bed assignment or a unit. The next thing on the list is our care team, and that's our crisis awareness response effort. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later, so I'm going to skip that point right now and then go on to the staff shadow program. This is something that we do where we place a staff side by side with the youth for the day. Obviously, we can't do that in all cases because of staffing and things, but we do that for those kids that we feel might need it or, you know, might need protected by other youth. Next slide. Family engagement. This family engagement and using family engagement to reduce isolation is very, very important. You know, one of the things that we did was we opened up our visitation hours. So we now offer visiting of families every day of the week. We also don't have any restrictions as far as how many times that a family can visit. So if you want to see your child every day, you can. We still have specific hours that they need to follow because we don't want to always take them out of educational services, but we offer those and we will provide the opportunity to visit during the day if they need to. We just work on scheduling that. If a youth is placed in isolation, we implemented conference calls with the families to discuss the reasons for isolation. And we try to do these pretty quickly after the youth is placed in isolation. We'll have that counselor and the family discuss the youth's behaviors, and then together the staff and the family collaborate, you know, on strategies to help the youth make better decisions. If an incident does take place where physical force is needed, which at times could lead to isolation, we do what we call debriefings with the staff and the youth involved, and we include the families with that. The debriefings are like an evaluation tool for all that are involved, and it also gives the families a chance to have input. We've also implemented several different family events. We tasked each of our facilities to come up with, you know, different and unique opportunities to involve the families. For example, we have one facility that allows families to come and join in for some volunteer activities like religious services. One facility does this workshop that we call Family Ties, and families participate together with the youth in like informational sessions on groups that are conducted. We involve mental health staff in that. They do like a Healthy Families workshop. We provide facility tours to the families. We have family days. We do parent-teacher conferences, and we also have family councils. We have done a lot to try to involve the families more in our facilities, and I believe that has really helped with our reduction in isolation. Another thing that we do is we have a token economy system where youth can earn points every hour throughout the day, and they can utilize their points for rewards. Some of the rewards might be letting them sleep in a little bit extra on the weekends, maybe extra recreational activities. We might have a movie and popcorn night. Each facility has different things that they do for that. We also do individual behavior plans. So if there's a youth that is having difficulty, we might have the individual behavior plans that are put together, and then staff work with the youth on that plan. We utilize the treatment team to include mental health staff to assist in putting those plans together. If the youth are placed in isolation during visual checks, staff should be encouraged to discuss alternatives with the youth to help them return to general population. They're talking to them. You know, that helps out a lot with de-escalation. And not just anyone can place a youth in isolation. We have supervisors that have to approve the youth to be placed in isolation, and there's a review process that's in place. We review the youth and document why the youth would need to stay in isolation if it's necessary. So, you know, we have not completely done away with it, but it is very important that that there is a review process and there is documentation. And then if a youth continues to be aggressive or is really posing a threat in our general population to himself or others, we have a program which we call our MAC program, which is our Making a Change program. It's a structured and safe therapeutic environment that assists youth in developing the appropriate social skills while continuing to participate in education and treatment programs just within a controlled setting. We're able to have a few additional staff in that program, but the youth are constantly participating in programs. They're in education, they do recreation, leisure time programs. They have, it's just in a little bit more of a controlled setting. Okay, so now I'm going to specifically talk about what I said earlier on the slide that talked about the care team. I wanted to talk a little bit about this. It's called our Crisis Awareness Response Effort. Oh, I'm sorry, I think I went too far on my slides. Okay. The purpose of the care team is to provide a primary focus to de-escalate the situation, attempt to resolve the student's issues and or primary stressor without the need for the use of force or isolation. So you might ask, why did we implement the care team? Like, where did it come from? We did because our use of force numbers were high, our injuries from the use of force were high, and our use of isolation numbers were high. So we developed this care team as an alternative to the use of force and isolation. So the care team is staffed 24 hours a day. It is comprised of treatment staff, custody staff, or any staff that can be a part of that care team. But the one thing that we do is we try to make sure that if you are on a post that you don't need to be relieved. That way, those staff can go directly to the situation when the care team is called. Different shifts could have different numbers of the care team depending on what staff are working those hours. We usually have a counselor that's on the care team until approximately 8 p.m. Training, we actually do provide a short training for those on the care team so that staff understand the purpose behind it and are given directions as far as de-escalating and how to respond. But all of our staff, every one of our Division of Youth Services staff goes through motivational interviewing training, calming the storm, which is another de-escalation training that we have, and trauma informed care training. This care team training is just a quick addition to what skills and how to use those skills. Activation is through just basic normal radio communications. The staff will call the care team to a location, and then they'll just report to that area. And then the staff responding will just talk to the staff that are on site to receive a brief overview of the situation, and then they'll try to remove the youth, from the area if possible to try to talk to them. Removing the youth from the area or that situational trigger seems to work well. One thing we struggled with at the beginning was getting staff to understand that calling the care team is not a sign of weakness. We're all trying to support each other, and the goal is to de-escalate the youth, and not one person can always resolve an issue with a youth. We need to let others help us. The youth learn that staff can step back and allow others to help them. This also teaches them, the youth, when they see how staff respond to situations. It's also an opportunity for staff to kind of step out of the situation, because, sometimes the staff in the situation can just escalate it, or it may just be that the youth is just mad at that staff, or that, the staff reminded them of something that really agitated them. But it gives that staff a chance to have some help with the situation. Staff should be calm when responding to a call for the care team. We always encourage them to use a low voice and a controlled tone, maintain patience with the youth, and also maintain personal space. I wouldn't recommend getting right up in the youth's face if he's angry about something. Remain objective, listen to the youth, listen to them vent, because a lot of times that's all they want. Sometimes the youth just needs a few minutes to just step back and think about their decisions, and we do allow that to happen, kind of give them some space and some time. And one thing to keep in mind is that we don't use the care team as like a disciplinarian. They are to assist the youth in calming down and establishing a safe and secure environment. Sometimes the care team doesn't work, and the youth escalate and might even become physically aggressive. And if the care team doesn't feel that they are making progress, then they can call for assistance or just follow the use of force continuum if it gets to that point. Upon completion of the care team response, we have a member that completes a debriefing form, and then that form identifies the staff that responded to the situation, what youth and staff were involved, a brief summary of the situation, and then the outcome of the situation, so whether or not it helped or not. And then we kind of look at these forms at our incident monitoring meetings every day. And incident monitoring meetings is where we have all of our department heads together and review each of the incidents from the day before. We're trying to get to a point to where we're really tracking these forms and looking at these monthly and, providing, kind of looking to see what the frequency and the outcomes of the care team responses are. But what we've seen is that they're working quite frequently. And as you can see on that PowerPoint, I have the term supported culture. And I included that because it's just a part of our culture now. Everyone just kind of knows that the care team is there to help, and we utilize it, we call for it. We've even had some of our adult facilities asked how we've implemented and asking us for advice on how to implement it in the adult facilities. So now what I'm going to do is kind of go through a couple of examples of where we've utilized the care team and how they've worked and what we've done with it. So an example was that, like for one example, we had two youth that were playing a game of chess. And the game escalated where the youth were throwing to the point to where they were pretty much throwing chess pieces at each other and arguing. So the YDS, which in our terms is the Youth Developmental Specialist, working the unit, could not get the youth to stop arguing. And in fact, they even began to argue with the staff member. So the YDS called the care team to respond to the unit. When the care team arrived, one member was able to ask one of the youth to take a walk with him and kind of walk and talk with him. And the youth did, and they were able to resolve the issue with no use of force. Basically, the two youth were separated and just given that opportunity to vent to the staff, and the situation was over. The two youth both went back to the unit, and there were no issues. So this could have been an example that could have turned into a physical fight with a youth, which probably would have resulted in use of force. None of that happened. So no isolation, youth went back to normal activities. Another example that we have, there was a youth that became upset when he was told to return back to his unit for the evening. He was out, I think, in the controlled general area that we have in one of our facilities and was told to finish up and go back to the unit. Well, he got mad, became argumentative, and began throwing some laundry clothes that was around and throwing some papers. So the care team was called and talked to the youth. And at first, he continued to argue with the care team. I mean, he wasn't going to calm down. And then he listened, and then all of a sudden, it was like he just started listening to him, and he calmed down and walked back to the unit with no problems. And then I want to also talk about one other example for you. We had a youth who was arguing with another youth in the day room. The youth got so mad that they flipped over one of the chairs. So the youth developmental specialist called for that care team, and when they arrived, they asked the youth to talk to them, and the youth started talking with the staff and began to de-escalate and calm down. So again, no use of force needed and no isolation. This incident ended up just being reviewed by the treatment team for sanction. Maybe didn't earn their points for token economy. And I know some of you are probably sitting back there saying, well, some will probably ask why we allowed that situation to get to the point to where they were flipping over the chair. Well, they didn't hit anyone, they did not break the chair, and they did not show any other form of aggression and no other threats. So the care team arrived and resolved the situation. Again, with no use of force, no isolation. So as you can see, we have situations where the care team works, but we also have situations where the care team does not work. And we do have to utilize force, or you know, something breaks out, we have to you know, we have to use our force continuum or something like that. So I'm not always saying that it does always work, but to have this alternative is a huge benefit for us, and we have seen it work in a lot of cases. In the past, if we called for assistance, it was usually like for a QRT team, a quick response team, and those staff would usually respond to having to use force or come to a situation that they know is escalating. You know, calling the care team just gives us another way to handle situations first. And it's also an opportunity to teach the youth how to handle situations, and staff can role model how to resolve conflict. It allows that youth to, it also allows that youth and sometimes to save face in the situation around the other youth, and utilize those skills in, you know, future situations. So I think that's the end of mine, so I'm going to turn it over to Nick from Oregon, and he is going to discuss and share some of his alternatives.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, I'm Nick from Oregon, and I will be sharing what's been going on over here to reduce isolation. I'm getting some feedback, so it's all right, so in Oregon, the feedback is really bugging. Our focus has been as well, and we have several we started several initiatives that are focused on looking at isolation and how to reduce it. And this slide kind of talks about just sort of the background on that process there. So what we quickly decided is that our historical way of creating specialized units to deal with youth that are already down that path with displaying egregious behavior just wasn't working. And so what we quickly did is we developed a new team of staff, and we call them skill development coordinators, and we deployed those staff to various facilities that had kids that were struggling the most. And so that was one of our initial kind of responses to reducing isolation. So those staff, you know, are recruited, they interview, and they receive special training around how do you meet the needs on an individual basis for youth. And that has been going well for the past 2.5 years in our system here. One of our other work groups that we started looked at specifically what leads up to incidences of isolation, what happens when youth are in isolation, and then how do we return those youth in a planful way back to their living units. And so out of those efforts, several recommendations have been made and implemented in our system as well. Ultimately, just like what Christine said and Ned said at the beginning, that we're focused on using isolation more effectively, making sure that isolation stays are tied to specific incidences that are a threat to safety to the youth or to others, and that really we're trying to use any time that's spent away from a youth's living unit, really honing in on what the problem was and how can we deliver some skill building around that problem to avoid it in the future. So that's kind of the backdrop, if you will, for what's been going on in Oregon. So this next slide talks about, you know, our culture shift, and these are the things that we are working very diligently to take root in our facilities and in our specific living units. So we are really focused on getting the staff and units looking at how to be proactively engaged. So how do we problem that goes goes along with specific trainings that we offer, visiting living units and observing how staff interact with youth, and then providing feedback to specific staff and to the unit in general they can incorporate. Just giving them pointers for, how could we avoid a situation, or how can we make little improvements in our day-to-day schedule or environments to just make things run more effectively and more smoothly. Some of the other things that we have implemented specifically is our living units, just like any other living unit around the nation, they get cramped. Kids feel like they're cooped in and they just can't get away. So we've opened up more of our facilities to the idea of just allowing kids to get off the unit and take a break and take in some fresh air on a proactive basis. Even with knowing which kids tend to struggle and what their triggers are, if we can just go and on a regular basis take that young person out for a walk and let them vent if they need to, or just decompress, that's much better. The time spent there is much better than having to spend time de-escalating a situation and using a lot of staff hours that way. We also found that sometimes youth will find their way into an isolation setting because they don't feel safe otherwise, and so they will ramp up their behavior just enough to get themselves in isolation, or even if it's for a timeout. Sometimes our timeouts occur where our isolation also occurs, and the youth will refuse to return to the living unit. And oftentimes we find those situations are around safety concerns that the youth have, and so training our staff, training our intervention staff to ask about that on the front end, we can get better information and maybe reduce or resolve whatever the concern is. And then, so therefore, our youth feels more comfortable in the living unit and is less likely to act quickly just to get into isolation. Peer-to-peer problem solving, again, expecting the youth to belong and contribute to their communities. And so if there is a problem, we need to, on a proactive basis, address those concerns before it turns into a behavior incident. And all that's attached to how do you build a sense of community on your, in your facility or on your living units. Probably the most exciting or the most recent thing that we've done as an agency is that we built from the ground up an entire living unit that serves what we're calling emotionally reactive youth. And so that has been in play for about 2 months now, where this unit has been created and the youth are there, and we're having a lot of success. I just looked at a data poll today. Those youth were responsible for a high percentage of incidents and isolation stays when they were dispersed throughout our facilities. And now that they've been put on this specialized unit, their rate of isolation and rate of incidents has dropped significantly. So that's been really encouraging to us here in Oregon just in the recent few days. So this next slide is talking about some of the specific tools and interventions amongst other ones that we are using in order to reduce isolation. And the first one here is the Advanced Behavioral Directive, and I'm going to talk in specific detail about that here in a couple slides, so I'll skip through that one for now. I know we mentioned before in the past that at 2 of our facilities we have created a blue room, and this is an idea that we got from our Department of Corrections here. I know it's blue room concept is across our nation as an intervention tool, but just like it says, it's actually one of our rooms that has been painted blue, and there can be either different nature scenes or just images that are calming can be incorporated into the paint scheme. But in ours here in Oregon, we have a flat screen TV that's mounted, and we have the ability to play all kinds of calming scenes, videos, and whatnot. So just to allow a young person to decompress should they need to. And we have youth that request to go to the blue room quite often. Another concept or another tool that we're asking staff to do is to layer intervention. So just because one thing didn't work in the moment, can we try another thing? And so it's coming up with a list of those things that can be quickly accessed in the moment as far as tools for the staff. And so we call that layering interventions, and one of our facilities calls it take the extra 10. So before we move to the next punitive step, if that's the direction that's going, can we take the extra 10 and figure out something else that we can do instead? And then we have made efforts to structure our mentor programs. So these are youth that are more adjusted in our systems and that are able and ready and willing to give back to youth that struggle. And so we've come up with, again, criteria for who gets the mentor, and then also provide those people who qualify training as well in terms of what are the expectations of a mentor, how does a mentor effectively intervene, how do they help younger kids that struggle develop and get the skills that they have now. And so that's been, again, a process that's always sort of existed in our system, but there wasn't a whole lot of structure to it, and which then makes it difficult to replicate elsewhere. So we put effort in that area, and several of our units now also have live-in mentors. So these are, again, youth that have volunteered, that have stepped up and said, I want to help, and so we will actually bring them and have them live on a unit to help the other youth that are struggling. So I'm going to talk specifically now about our advanced behavioral directives and hone in on the specific parts there and expand it and hopefully be able to convey what they are, why we chose to go this route, and how they're used. So advanced behavioral directives isn't something that Oregon created on their own. This is an intervention that has existed for many years in a variety of settings, in particular mental health and treatment settings uses advanced behavioral directives. It's often associated with trauma informed care, and you'll see why here in a moment, because the ABDs really hone in on what is triggering for a youth and how can we avoid those triggers. And when we can avoid them, how can we minimize the impact of that in terms of a trauma response. So for our youth that come through the Oregon Youth Authority, the intake process includes developing an ABD for every youth. So our intake also to account, using a formal trauma assessment. We incorporate our psychological recommendations. We look at the youth on the living unit to see how they are dealing with adjusting to living in a living environment like that. And then finally, we will take all that information and conduct a youth interview to develop our advanced behavioral directives. That's the context for ABDs. So really the purpose folds into everything that we're trying to do in terms of our culture change here in Oregon, and it's really important for staff to realize that when they sit down to do the interview with the youth to create the ABD, that it's really another opportunity to build rapport, and that when we take the time to listen to the youth and how things are going, when we take the time for them to tell us things that they struggle with, that's all validating. That's all part of getting to know the youth and helping them really believe that we are there to help them and to support them in any way that we can. The staff then get to learn, what specifically gets under a youth's skin and what potentially is a trauma trigger for them. And that's important information to have. And it doesn't happen overnight. Even though this does happen at intake, the ABD can be changed whenever new information presents, and so sometimes it takes multiple opportunities with the youth to sit down and get to know them for the ABD to really become an effective tool. So once we get the triggers out there that we know that the youth struggles with, then we can help staff understand or develop ways to avoid triggering a youth, and the more that we can avoid that, the better off that we're going to be. In instances where we have to conduct our business because of the nature of where we are at, sometimes we understand that can be triggering to our youth. And so, again, helping staff understand how do we form or implement our interventions in a way that minimizes the impact that the trauma trigger may be having on the youth is important as well. So that's the purpose for our ABDs. And again, this is an effort to be proactive. How do we avoid a bigger incident by taking the time on the front end to be purposeful around the things that we know about the youth, and how do we go about interacting with them in an effective way. So this next couple slides is just really going to expand what really goes into an ABD. And then at the end, I'll show you just the front page of a sample ABD from our system, so you can look at that. You can see what that looks like on a form. But there's 4 elements to the ABD. One is all focused on crisis prevention. The second is what is the escalation response that the unit, the system, the staff can use when a youth does become escalated. 3 is captures what are the youth strengths and interests, and then 4 is a crisis plan that contains elements specific to that youth that should an incident or behavioral incident escalate significantly, we know some things that we can do or not do ahead of time to make that situation as best as possible. So in the crisis prevention section, we are identifying the triggers, and again, this is specific to the youth, although oftentimes they sound very similar when you talk to one youth to the next, and so I'm just going to cover some things that came off one of the forms that I reviewed when I was preparing this presentation. So the triggers can be something like too much noise on the unit, or that when people are yelling and arguing, it just could set a youth off. And so again, that's information that the staff would gather and spread amongst themselves to know that, hey, when the unit's getting loud or people start yelling and arguing, then this specific person is not going to handle that well, isn't going to react to that well. And then we also ask the youth, okay, so when staff try to intervene in a situation like this, what are some things that you've seen or that you know won't help? And so that's what that next section is. So it would make sense that if a youth identified too much noise as a trigger, then staff raising their voice at them isn't going to help in that moment. Or in this situation, staff trying to address me from clear across the unit, which probably also includes raising their voice. So those are examples of interventions that wouldn't help this specific person when staff are trying to intervene. The next section is the escalation response. Okay, so when either the staff or the youth recognize that they are at a spot to where they're not handling things well, what can be done to help them re-regulate and get back on track? So some specific things that came off of this form was taking a walk. Remember I talked earlier about nature walks, so that's kind of filtering down to the youth as an option that they have. Using headphones to listen to music, or talking with a mentor. So all things that we've talked about earlier that the youth are seeing as actual resources to them on their living units. The ABD also includes a youth strengths section, and the idea is that staff will be reviewing these ABDs on a regular basis, and it's important for the staff to see the young person for the total person that they are, and so we always include a youth strengths there. So again, specifically on this one, the young person identified that they like to read for pleasure, they like to be goal-oriented, and they like to act on behalf of their peers to keep people safe. And so those are things that, as a staff, if they can keep that present on their mind when they're actually trying to intervene with the youth or get to know the youth, they'll have some things right off the bat that they maybe can enter the conversation with. And then the last section there, number 4, is the crisis planning section. So again, this is for a situation that has significantly escalated. What can be done to handle that incident in the most effective way? And so for this young person, doesn't like to have hands-on, doesn't like to have staff go hands-on with them, and so the more space that we can give him, the better off that he's going to be. And so with this particular youth, staff have been told, give him as much space as possible, clear the other youth out of there, and allow him to the time and the space to re-regulate. And that ultimately So here's how our ABDs are implemented in our system. And so, like I said, all youth have ABD via the intake process. So they're created, within the first 45 days, using the information that the intake units can gather on them and conduct that youth interview. And ABDs are updated by our mental health staff at least every 90 days. And the ABDs can be updated instantaneously should important information come out as well. So So even though they're created at intake, they're constantly being reviewed, and we have the ability to adjust them at a moment's notice when something comes up. Our ABDs are stored in our electronic database, and many units have the practice of printing them out and having them in a binder so that staff can, review them on a daily or weekly basis. And also, when an ABD is updated, the mental health staff is trained to alert the staff that the specific person has a change to their ABD. The staff that are part of our facilities that act as third parties or that are there to support the staff during incidents, they also too have access to the ABDs and are encouraged/required to review them on a regular basis as well, so that, again, if they are involved in intervention, they'll have a better idea of how to go about working with that particular person. And I know it's really tough probably to see that on your screen, but this is just a one-page, first-page example of our ABD form that's in our system. And you can see, well, I guess if you squint, you can see the sections that I just reviewed there. So there's the crisis prevention, there's the escalation response, and then on the back side of that would be the elements for there. And so you can just visualize, how this would live on a form for staff to resource when they're preparing to work with a young person. So that is just an expanded view of ABDs in Oregon, why it is that we went there in our efforts to be proactive, how do we create them, and how do we use them on a regular basis. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peter.
All right, Nick, thank you very much. This is Peter Forbes from the Department of Youth Services in Massachusetts. If I get this going. So for us, on culture and mindset, it was really important to make sure that we strike the correct context for where specifically isolation, we call it room confinement, but for where isolation fits in the whole construct of secure residential operations. And our approach has been to really keep that conversation focused in the safety realm, and it's about staff and youth safety. We don't use it for punishment. And, part of that shift for us, it's been a broader shift around the whole idea of trying to develop kids, viewing youth as assets, listening to youth, and it's been a broader shift. And we were very clear that when we took on a reduction in the use of isolation, that it was really about safety and not about punishment. And there is a discussion that needs to take place about punishment, but room confinement and isolation is really not the way to do it. So, part of what's gone on in this overall process has been a shift, and we've moved away from a heavy sanction-based daily management of kids in programs toward a more positive engagement and positive incentive-based program. And one of the tricks to that process has been that we've allowed a lot of discretion at the program level, and in Massachusetts we're broken out by regions, so that the regional managers have the opportunity to really kind of develop that with input from the central office. And we moved away from what I describe as the traditional approach where kids wake up with, wake up with 100 points and lose points all day long, and that just, for some kids it works well, and it's good for staff because it's very concrete, but for some kids it doesn't work at all, and that becomes really toxic and really problematic. So we've moved toward a more incentive-based programming. We also, nationally, I think there's a lot of agreement that cognitive-based strategies have proven to be really effective with adolescents and with juvenile justice involved youth, and we shifted to DBT in all of our programs. So as kids move through the system, they're getting DBT everywhere they go, and they essentially build that skill portfolio up from their detention stay, through their commitment stay, through their transition back into the community. In the first several years, we've been doing DBT for 10 years now, 10 or 11 years. In the first several years, it was really viewed as being solely in the clinical realm, and the direct care staff essentially write that off and say, let the clinicians deal with that. Somewhere around the fourth year of our process, we were very intentional about getting our direct care staff, particularly our more senior line supervisors, involved. They had all been trained, but we were intentional about getting our direct care staff, particularly our line supervisors, to co-facilitate the DBT group. So you have a licensed clinician and a supervisor that are actually running the DBT group with the kids. And what has happened is our direct care staff have embraced DBT and use DBT throughout the day in the living units. So it's been a huge shift for us that makes our living units that much more healthy for kids and staff. So we've initiated, as far as alternatives, we've initiated a number of different things. One is a debriefing process. We've spent a lot of time up here on not just putting kids in their rooms, but figuring out constructively, how do you get them out? When are they ready? We've used an individual support plan process, which I'm going to describe in a little more detail. We have really put emphasis on having community meetings where staff run a weekly meeting with the kids and try to find out not only how they're doing, but any suggestions that they have. Every time a youth makes a suggestion on programming that the staff gravitate and grab and use, it increases the buy-in. It's all basic stuff that you're probably all doing. And the other thing that we've done, and we actually lost it at one point because of a collective bargaining issue, but we've reinstituted shift change, and we do a 30-minute shift change between all shifts, where the expectation is that they don't just exchange keys, but they actually talk about kids, problem solve, and be strategic about what needs to happen and what people need to look out for going on to the next shift. Visits, talk about what's going on, phone calls, and 30 minutes is short or long depending upon how you look at it, but it's a really valuable pause as the next shift is going in to take over the program. And we've kind of re-emphasized some of the basics that we all know work. As far as the individual support plan itself, we initiated this probably 5 or 6 years ago. We memorialized it in a policy. We had a special management policy that essentially, the special management policy resulted in a lot of kids sitting in chairs in hallways, doing not much, maybe some busy work at their on the desktop. The individual support plan is a really urgent response to aggressive behavior. The really positive new wrinkle is that we include the parent in the youth and actually have them in the room and ask them, what do we need to do to redirect the situation with what's going on with this situation with the kid in the program. and to the extent that we can elicit suggestions or requests from the family or the youth, try to use them in the plan. It's time limited. It's generally for 2 or 3 days. We train on it, and a lot of our programs have really used that team approach to, kids that are not doing well in the program. I think everybody on this phone has probably been in a program where you see a particular kid that's like totally checked out, not bought into the behavior management system or the point level system, is spending a lot of time in a hallway or maybe time in their room. And that's the kid that is either being disruptive in class or being disruptive in the day room. And the individual support plan policy, which I can share with folks, essentially just gives us a structure to problem solve and get that kid back on track and not allow kids to fall on the margins, to fall out of the mainstream programming. So that's the individual support plan. And then the second thing that I was going to talk about today was our repair system, which essentially is a version of a sanction system. It's an accountability framework. It's very different than taking points away from a kid all day long. It's very much individualized, and it forces our staff to really look at what's going on with this kid, and how can I get them back on track and have them effectively repair what has happened. So sometimes it's as simple as some mild acting out in class or in the cafeteria, and that can be resolved essentially on the spot, to more aggressive behavior where you have a lot of what people on this phone probably already do around loss of privileges, writing assignments, work-offs on the unit, activity restriction, separation from the classroom, written apologies. One of the things that we've done, not in all our programs, but it's catching on in a number of our programs that are using this, is an ability for the youth to actually have some say-so and some ability to choose, which repair they're gonna engage in to get them back on track. And that didn't come from me. I actually went to a program where they were modeling that, where the kids actually had some choice. I really liked that. And the repair system is, kind of a continuation of what you've heard, throughout this presentation, where we're actually, putting a value on the relationship between the staff and the youth, and trying to leverage that relationship so that the staff actually is required to understand what's going on with the kid and, help move them along. So I'm looking at a question up here. Do we use structured behavior contracts as part of our efforts to reduce room isolation? If so, what do yours look like? We don't have written contracts. It's really more of a negotiation with the youth around safety and being able to reality test that. And I think it's, what we've spent a lot of time on is, we do use room confinement for to quell, serious acting out behavior, put kids in their rooms and lock the door. We have a policy that governs, how you have to supervise and keep that kid safe while he or she is in their room. And then we have expectations that staff will check on them, that clinical staff will get involved to the extent that they're present on the unit, and that we're negotiating with that youth to figure out how to get them safely out of their room and back into some place on the program. Doesn't have to be into the mainstream day room, or they don't have to go right back into class. They may wind up spending some time in another part of the program. They may have to sit at a desk or sit at a chair and write something so that we can observe the fact that they're actually under control, and that, you know, you get enough assurance that they're going to at least try to get on with their day. So that is, you know, I covered a lot relatively quickly, but we've had a lot of time to do this progression, and it's a combination of really trying to beef up quality programming and address the whole issue of kids acting out and not complying in the secure residential programs. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ned and Brendan, I believe, back at CJCA.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you to Nick and Christine as well. Christine had to leave us, and she will respond. Some of the questions are generic, and so I'm going to ask Nick and Peter to respond to them. But some of the questions are very specific to the care team or some aspect of the Indiana program, and Chris has committed. She had something she had to attend to. She stayed as long as she could, but she will respond to the question of the person who sent it. So from Richard in Louisiana, why don't Nick, if you could handle this one. Richard in Louisiana asked, I'd like to hear some more differences in gender alternatives, as I have found that males can resolve issues more quickly, while females may harbor more animosity over a longer period of time, even after a mediation and conflict resolution is attempted. This was asked actually during Chris's presentation.
Sure, I can respond to that. Oregon's perspective. Our female facility actually leads the charge in a positive way around the use of isolation by just not really having a ton of it occur there. Of course, there's always going to be some outlier females that you know are not the norm and definitely are the exception. And we struggle to even get that facility to participate in some of our efforts because they kind of get the feeling like that they just don't have the same type of issues with isolation that we do. And so what I can point the person who asked the question to, what that facility has really done quite well, and it took several years, took about 5 years, is they have the culture that every living unit is a community, and each of the youth has some responsibility to that community, and specifically to the well-functioning of that community. And so when there's a problem, or if there's a problem between girls, or between a girl and a staff, there's some community responsibility and pressure to handle that problem as quickly and effectively as possible to be able to move on. Now, that wasn't always the case. I was there for a year and a half where we saw that the girls would hang on to certain issues and keep coming up, day after day or month after month. But honestly, they have done really well addressing that problem through their community building efforts.
Thank you, Nick. So Peter, this was a question for Chris as well, but it's one that I think you touched on a little bit. How often do you review youth while they're in isolation? Is there a specific amount of time or numbers of time?
So our policy calls for what we call constant motion, which means that anytime the kids are in their rooms, and that includes bedtime, we have one staff assigned to the bedrooms that's doing constant motion. And then as it relates to youth that are actually placed in isolation, against their will for, acting out, I'm not exactly sure. I'd have to pull the policy up, but I know within the first 15 minutes, someone needs to get in there with that kid and start to ask the questions and see if they're starting to calm down. Obviously, if the kid is still out of control, that's different. But we have a very structured protocol about supervision, interaction, and then at what point does the clinician, if available, go in and sit and talk with the kid. So it's all spelled out in policy. I just don't have that up in front of me. But it's a very short time frame, and there are expectations that we're not constantly, but regularly checking in, trying to mediate, trying to get the kid out of his room. And, we switch off so that the person that put the kid in his room may not be the person that goes back and talks to him, or he may be, depending upon the situation. And the idea is to try to get the door opened as soon as possible. Sometimes you might have a kid where you actually open the door and he stays in his room for a little while longer until he gets it together. So it's a progression.
Great. This could be answered by both Peter and Nick. It's from Lashana in Kentucky. Is there a specific name of the de-escalation training that your staff utilize? Is it something you've developed? Is it something off the shelf? Is it something does it have a particular name, and is it somewhere on the on your website if other states want to look at it?
From a Massachusetts perspective, believe it or not, we call our de-escalation training de-escalation training. But we do have a module that's written up. I don't know that it's on our portal, but we train on it. Everybody gets it in basic training at the very beginning of their employment, and they also get it annually through a recertification process. That's the formal de-escalation. And then we do fairly intensive training around DBT, which is more proactive than reactive. And we've also done a lot of motivational interviewing training, which is a best practice approach to negotiation and interviewing kids. So we're doing a whole bunch of stuff, but formal de-escalation, I would be able to email a curriculum out on what we're training on for staff.
Great. What we could do is, if you send it to CJCA, just to let everyone who's on the call know, we'll post it under resources on the CJCA website, so everyone would have access to it.
Sure.
Nick, did you want to respond to that as well?
Sure, I would echo everything that Peter just said. Specifically for curriculum, all of our employees through new employee orientation get verbal de-escalation through Crisis Prevention Institute, CPI training. And so that's something, again, all new employees get on the front end, and then that's regularly reviewed, probably on a yearly or every other year basis, where they get retrained on CPI, and then part of that would involve verbal de-escalation. Beyond that, our trainings or consultations in between are really unit-specific or incident-specific, that will come in and look at a situation that's happened and then kind of walk through how that could have been done differently in the future. So we kind of do little on-demand type trainings based on specific situations that are brought to us.
Thank you, Nick. This is one from Kimberly in Arizona, and this is one that I think anyone could have asked. What do you do with the youth who persistently antagonizes youth who are larger and stronger than him or her to the point that many fights are initiated? So it's just someone not picking on someone their own size, but they're antagonistic and they're going after larger and stronger kids. Either Peter or Nick, do you want to reply to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough one. It's a maturity issue. We would probably go with the individual support plan and try to do some problem solving, possibly bring some of the bigger kids in. Sometimes that's age, where some of the younger kids, and that's been our experience, some of the younger kids act immature and the older kids lose privileges, and that becomes really problematic and results in, potentially someone, striking another kid. I don't have an easy answer for that. Sometimes it's a matter of matching the right kids in the right programs, but certainly that smaller, younger kid needs some serious structure and some support. And I think to the extent that the bigger and older kids understand that the program is taking it seriously and trying to structure a response, they'll respect that because they're aggravated, not threatened. So I don't know. I mean, that's a tough one.
Nick, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I don't know that I would have a ton more to say differently than what was just shared, in that it is a difficult problem when it does arise. I would point folks to, one of the ways that we use our mentor program in that aspect on both sides of that issue. The person that is doing the bullying, if you want to call it that, and the person that's receiving it, and using our youth mentors to help us either address the problem specifically or to help us out around what's going to work either generically or specifically for those two youth. And sometimes it's a situation where we have to move youth to different living units to address the issue as well. So sometimes population management becomes the intervention there.
There's a little feedback coming in again in your answer. Did you refer to youth mentors to work with the kid?
Yeah, youth mentors is often a good strategy for helping on both sides of that equation there.
Okay, that's great. Another question that came in from Michael in Washington. I presume each of you has a behavior management system. So Michael was saying, can we get access to the behavior management system and tools that you use to track and manage youth? So if, again, Peter and Nick, and we'll ask Chris as well, if you could send the behavior management system and any other tools you use to track and manage kids, send that to us at CJCA. Again, we'll put it up on the resource section. You can find that on our website. And again, everyone who has access to who's on the call today can get access to that.
Sure.
There was a question from Aquila. I'm not sure what jurisdiction, but she asked, can you speak about dealing with the higher level youth as far as alternatives since they're unable to leave the facility? That was addressed, I guess, directly to Chris. You know what, I thought this might be a good opportunity, Peter, for you to talk about the program that you developed. I'm blanking on the name at the moment, but it's a program where you actually can move a youth from the facility, and the youth responds and then comes back to the facility.
Yeah, I mean, what we've done is we call it our stabilization program.
Right.
And we opened a program, and it's a small secure program, 10 beds, for youth that are being violent and hurting people in the rest of our service continuum. So if a young person in secure treatment hurts a staff member, we have the option of moving them out to the Westfield Stabilization Unit. And that program is designed on a very individualized basis. It's not a special management unit. It's not a punishment unit. Those kids get 5.5 hours of education every day. They get all the clinical support that kids in other programs get, but it's a small, very well-staffed program where everything's individualized. For example, we don't run any clinical groups. All their clinical work is one-to-one. They're all on individual education plans. They do a lot of online work. They tend to be some of the older, more serious kids. And it gives us a safe place to try to resolve the harm that's been caused. It's allowed us, in some situations where a staff member might be inclined to press criminal charges, removing the kid from the program, placing them at the stabilization program, gives that staff member that was aggrieved or hurt some space and some safety in their workplace. And then what we do out there, this is a real quick overview, but what we do out there is it's very individualized about whether or not they actually go back to where they came from, or they wind up in a new placement and get reassigned, whether or not they might have if they're on the committed side, they might have their time assignment extended, and how long they stay in the stabilization unit is all predicated on their adjustment and of their safety and the staff safety at the program that they're going back to. So it's been, for us, it's been like a really invaluable asset. It's expensive to run a program just for that purpose, but it beats the alternative of locking that kid in his room for days at a time in the same program where they've actually hurt somebody that's working there. So it's given us a really nice option on the menu.
Great, and I know some of our states that participated in the first cohort of reducing the use of isolation. There were 8 of them. We were able to set up a conference call between them and Peter's staff at the stabilization unit, and they were extraordinarily impressed with it. And some are trying to fashion versions of it. And as Peter stressed, it's not a special management unit. It's not a dumping ground. It's actually a program to really engage kids in a very smaller and more staff-intensive situation. And so if you do need more information on that, I'm sure someone on Peter's staff could be helpful. This is from Kelly in Wyoming, and Nick, it's directed to you, so I hope the feedback is solved. Can you say more about the substance of the program in the unit for the emotionally reactive youth?
Sure, I can do my best to respond to that. So that unit is called the University of Life, and like I mentioned, we built it from the ground up. It's still a work in process, meaning that it's only been online for 2 months, but I could talk about what we have in place as of now. So it is a unit that has smaller youth numbers. I mean, currently it has 8 youth, has capacity for 14, but we didn't want to open it with 14 until we took some time to look at what we have and kind of work out any kinks before we brought it to full capacity. So even when it is full capacity, it's about half of what we would normally have on a living unit. So I think the plan is to bring it up to 12 youth. And then we have more staff assigned to that living unit. So that was our goal, was to create a unit with less staff, or less youth and more staff, so that the youth could get more individual attention from each staff member than what typically happens on our normal living units. So that's one thing that we set out to accomplish, and so far it's going well. The other thing that we spent 2 weeks doing an intensive retreat with the staff to get them somewhat acclimated to the direction that we're going. Again, these are youth that historically would have been high users of isolation, and so getting the staff ready to look at situations as they unfold and having a mindset of, okay, we're not going to use isolation here, so what are we going to use? So we spent 2 weeks in a retreat format, just throwing scenarios at them as a team and having them kind of hammer out what we're going to do differently with these situations. So again, if you were to visit the unit now, you probably would see the staff struggling still with some of these situations that arise, and how do we interact or intervene in a way that doesn't lead to isolation, but we're getting there. The other thing that we have in place there is that we're trying, everything that happens on the unit is viewed through a developmental lens. So we want the focus of all of our programming, all of our schedule, all of our structure, anything that we do with the youth to be filtered through what is the developmental need of the youth, specifically for individual youth or this group of youth, and how do we focus what we're going to do with them through that developmental lens, as opposed to a traditional correctional or punitive lens. And so getting the staff to understand that putting a young person in isolation really runs perpendicular or contrary to that developmental lens is huge. A group of us within the agency also developed a specific treatment curriculum for that unit, and so we made it long enough to last about 9 months, so they're about a month and a half into it, and so that's something else that we are piloting and expect to shift and adjust as time goes on. But again, it's skill-based. It's focused on equipping these young people with the skills necessary to handle trauma triggers, to handle their emotional reactivity, and to ultimately have them rejoin a normal adolescent growth trajectory despite where they're located in the correctional setting. That's what our goal is, to create a normalized environment where they're getting the skills that any other young person would get, regardless of where they're at. So that's what I can offer in terms of what's in place right now in terms of substance and programming at the unit.
Great. Thanks again, Nick. So Peter, from Kelly in Wyoming, she phrases it, so you, Massachusetts, do not use any kind of point level system anymore. Could you expand on that a little bit? How you point level?
Sure. I mean, so we've moved more toward, I think it mirrors a level system or a phase system. And there are a number of differences in the way that we do it from the way we used to do it. For example, if a kid is on a particular phase which is associated with, privileges, and has a really bad incident or has a bad couple of days, they don't drop down to the bottom. In the past, if you had a real serious incident, you go really back to the intake stage. And the way it's set up now is it's almost like they step to the side and they're out of programming a little bit, but they return right back to where they were. And it's incentive based. We don't have a daily system where we're giving points and taking points all day long. The kids earn. It's a token economy system where they essentially earn privileges. And I'm not doing a good job explaining it, but it's very different, and we're really trying to get the kids bought into a progression in the program and an investment in the program. And then we incentivize the positive stuff, and we do repairs as it relates to infractions or, that are acting out.
Great, thank you, Peter. Kelly's other question was, Peter, what are the logistics of the shift change exchange of information? Do oncoming staff meet with outgoing staff in the units, or does the supervisor brief the oncoming staff? And what are the kids doing during this time?
So the kids are in their rooms. So we take a 30-minute pause between shifts, and we have staff supervision, but the kids are down in their rooms for the most part. And essentially, part of the shift that's leaving and part of the shift that's coming on meet with, if you use the first shift to the second shift as the example, it's 30 minutes, clinical, education, program management, direct care staff, and supervisors. So you might have 8 to 10 people. Some of them are staff that are leaving the program, and some of them are staff that are coming on the program for that shift. And it's a, kind of a brief overview of how things went day shift, what's going on the evening shift, what to look out for, which kids are not doing well that might need particular support or might need someone to speak to them as they're being let out of their room. And it's a really nice, it'd be nice to have an hour, but then the kids would be in their rooms for an hour. So we've set it up as a 30-minute exchange, and what happened in Massachusetts is, in order to make sure that the oncoming shift, that certain people get there early, and that the exiting shift actually stay a little later, we have to pay an overtime premium. So the shift change actually cost us, I can't remember what it was, but for the whole system for the year, it was like $100,000 or something like that. So it's an investment in safety and in a reasonable exchange of information between the two shifts. And it's been really, it's something that we always had, and we lost it through a grievance and a class action. We had a finding against us that we weren't paying people. So we were out of business on that for a few years, and then we rebuilt it and actually put the money in the budget to pay a small amount of overtime. So that's kind of a long answer, but it's been a real good quality piece for us.
Thanks, Peter. And this will be the last question because we're coming to the close of the session. So from Melanie in California, and Nick, you can take a quick crack at it, and then Peter. So how long did it take for the staff to buy into the changes that you've instituted on reducing isolation. Nick?
Yeah, I would say that we're still into that process as far as the buy-in. And so, again, we're about 2.5 years with our current efforts. And so how long is still yet to be determined. But what I can say is the more that we measure our rates and incidences of isolation and communicate that back out as a data feedback to our facilities and living units, and the more that we share success stories, the more staff that we get bought into the process. So, of course, on the front end, there is a lot of pushback. However, I think that we've done well with our use of data, use of information, and making sure that we consistently and regularly feed that back out to the staff so that they can see it for themselves. That coupled with our facility leadership, visiting every unit, every facility, multiple times a quarter to hear the concerns of staff has gone a long ways and towards building buy-in.
Great, thank you, Nick. Peter, you want to close it out with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you were starting from square one in a facility where you are a state that's really heavily reliant on isolation as a behavior management staple, I would suggest it's going to take 2 to 3 years really to turn the corner. It's a complicated process. We signed our first, and it has to be, we signed a policy, because this is not the kind of thing that's going to change by talking about it. You have to be really intentional and deliberate. So we have a policy that prohibits room confinement for punitive purposes. And we had to work right through. It wasn't just the direct care staff. Our program management staff and like some of our mid-level regional managers were not on board with this being something that they wanted to see happen. So we had to work through the management ranks. We had to use training. We had to work through the direct care workforce. We had to work through collective bargaining. It was a really complicated process, and there are still people 8 years later up here that are not happy. So it's not going to make you really popular as a manager necessarily taking this track, but I believe it's the right thing to do, and I believe that up here in Massachusetts, we're better off for it.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to emphasize what Peter just said. We are very grateful. CJC is very grateful to the leadership, both in Massachusetts, Indiana, and Oregon, for taking this on. And you don't win a popularity contest by taking it on. But one thing I think you've heard this afternoon, there are so many ways to give. You saw a toolbox at the beginning of each presentation. Many times the staff say, you're taking my management tool away from me, namely to be able to isolate a kid. But these jurisdictions have replaced that tool with a whole toolbox of tools, and you heard many of them this afternoon. And we'll post it, but we're going to have another webinar on reducing isolation in September, just to continue this conversation with all of you, and even more about the ways that, the creative ways that some states have developed to reduce the use of isolation. So again, I want to thank Christine Blessinger, Peter Forbes, and Nick Sotelo for their really terrific presentations this afternoon. I want to thank Brendan Donahue, who was here with me, who kept us online and organized for the entire webinar. And I want to thank all of you for participating. Brendan will send a link to everyone who registered for today's, participated in today's webinar. He will send a link within 48 hours to the webinar that is going to be archived, as all our webinars are, archived on YouTube. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great rest of the afternoon and evening. See you the next time.